Welcome to this Education and Philosophy podcast, part of a series introducing key ideas in education and philosophy. The ideas covered in this series are discussed in relation to their potential use to present-day thought and practice. This series draws from the book Education and Philosophy, published by Sage, to which there is a link below. This podcast will offer a short introduction to and outline critique of critical pedagogy. It has been argued, in an accompanying podcast, that the activity of critique is typically an idealizing form of judgment-making that has little to offer in terms of practical suggestions. It can, nonetheless, be pointed out that within the field of education there is a strong tradition of emancipatory praxis that sees itself as very much involved in practical interventions intended to charge teaching and learning with liberatory purpose. Emancipatory praxis within education has taken two obvious forms: liberal or progressive pedagogy on the one hand, and critical pedagogy on the other. In what follows, I will attempt to outline their key respective characteristics, as well as where they overlap. Liberal or progressive pedagogy has been particularly influential at the level of primary and secondary education. It adopts what is very much an Enlightenment view that the subject of education, the school child, possesses innate capacities that must be released from the bonds of ignorance, convention, and prejudice that inhibit her full human development, her progress to a full humanity. It wants to free the learner's intellectual and creative potential by removing the effects upon her development of a disfiguring and restrictive authority. This authority is conceived in terms of oppressive forms of schooling that inhibit the learner's growth and those elements in her background that have similarly distorted or frustrated the fulfillment of her innate capacities. The child is the site of an intervention whose primary focus is on her emotional and psychological growth, rather than just her intellectual development. The second form of emancipatory educational praxis, frequently referred to as critical or radical pedagogy, is to one degree or another related to Marxist theory and has been especially influential at the level of tertiary education, although versions of critical pedagogy address themselves to the primary and secondary school context as well. The social analyses of Frankfurt School critical theory have fed into critical pedagogy, but arguably the most vigorous form of educational praxis has been that which has drawn on the work of the Brazilian educator Paulo Freire. Freire argued that education is always a political practice, and that its pedagogy could be a practice of freedom. This critical pedagogy would enable the oppressed to understand the true circumstances of their condition and equip them with the critical awareness that might guide action in overturning their subjection. Such a pedagogy involves the teacher, who, in a state system, is always the representative and agent of oppression, in a constant reappraisal of her beliefs and her practices in order to fulfill a commitment to the people and the transformation of their social being. Critical pedagogues aim to interrupt existing forms of socialization by which students are unknowingly co-opted to a dominant order, and to replace these unthinking conventions with the more self-conscious, self-actualizing, and democratic modes of participation and self-formation. This is to be achieved by giving students the means to challenge the educational and social order that conditions them. Hence, critical pedagogues seek to anchor themselves in the context they dispute, and by so doing, they appear to collapse the distinction between educated critic and local practitioner. In this critical tradition, it is considered of central importance that only contextually embedded critiques will deliver their participants to emancipation. Emancipation cannot be passed down from above. It can only be achieved through practices of empowerment and self-emancipation, that is, through local and situated struggle. Clearly, critical pedagogues are more self-consciously political than progressive educators. They seek social transformation, a radical reordering of power relations. Progressives, by contrast, largely neglect social critique. At least they appear to do so in primary and secondary school classrooms. At the tertiary level, the critical pedagogue would argue, the liberal academic is content to work within the parameters of the existing social setup, accepting that the system of liberal democracy is essentially benign in its intentions, although its performance needs vigilant scrutiny and, where it falls short in its democratic commitments, robust criticism. Those last two sentences could be taken as a summary of what radical critique takes to be wrong with liberal progressive praxis. Its caution about change in fact amounts to collusion with an unjust, democratically deficient system. Yet liberal educational theory, emphasizing the democratic right of individuals and communities to exercise free choice in their own self-formation, shares with its more radical counterpart a distrust of authority in the form of state power, which encroaches upon and diminishes that freedom. The task of the liberal educator is to reconcile the obvious fact that it is the educational machinery of state education that equips young people with the capacities necessary for them to participate in a democracy. Both liberal and radical critics justify their judgments concerning social and educational practice by reference to an authority which legitimates their prescriptions. For the progressive, the legitimating authority is that of the sovereign moral agent, the self who authors her own destiny, whose autonomy is not to be violated by governmental power. The emancipatory or critical theorist bases her legitimacy in the authority of the people as an oppressed class, which is denied its completion as human beings. It will be clear that progressive and critical pedagogies share a certain idealism. These emancipatory pedagogies engage in a struggle for common humanity against systems that would deny it. As a result, they become framed by an Enlightenment worldview which puts forward definitive conceptions of what it means to become fully human. Both versions see education as the agent of liberation from a state of ignorance and dependence imposed by dominatory power. They view the same prospect of advancement to full humanity once men and women are set free from their servitude. They share a deep wariness about the concentration of power in a state or governmental form, conceiving of power as a resource that, in the wrong hands, threatens human freedom. They are both concerned to shape individual subjectivities and society in accordance with norms derived from their critical reflections on ideal forms of the self and social being. The criticism has been made that they thus impose a tribunal or system of judgment upon the management of human affairs. Critique, viewing a domain that it would like to police, thus becomes just another system of control, another attempt at exercising dominatory power. A further criticism of emancipatory education, radical and progressive, lies in the fact that its practitioners are everywhere obliged to transgress their commitments. However steadfast their intent to liberate their students from the shackles and blindfolds of illegitimate and oppressive power, they are agents of a system who cannot escape the coercive entailments of their role. Short of relinquishing their positions within the system, these teachers are inevitably caught up in the exercise of unequally distributed power, for instance, in preparing their students for systems of assessment that, by the lights of the emancipatory educator, are saturated by realities of social injustice. Unless they engage in a relentless and undeviating attack on their professional responsibilities, a total disobedience which would have to somehow avoid the gaze of those who have authority over them. The emancipatory educators are in practice obliged to dilute the purity of their commitments when encountering certain other realities of the places in which they work. These realities include those students who seem resistant to education's promise of full development, who fail to perceive that education, critical or otherwise, has any relevance to their future lives, or who just want qualifications that will get them a job. These constraining realities also include the surrounding educational environment, which is structured according to the requirements of power, that is, according to what authority wants from its schools and universities. But perhaps the most telling point against emancipatory pedagogy is that its suspicion of power and government and its elevation of freedom as a supreme aim amounts to an irresponsible and unrealistic refusal to accept that reason can never be detached from the workings of power. These ideas are discussed in more detail in Chapter 10 of Education and Philosophy. If you would like to hear another podcast discussing a key idea related to education and philosophy, click below. Thank you for listening.